It was a crisp autumn morning in a small town, where the air carried a hint of wood smoke and the streets were lined with trees shedding their golden leaves. The town square was bustling with activity, as people gathered for a special ceremony. Chairs were neatly arranged, a stage was set up with flags and banners, and a sense of anticipation filled the air. The occasion was a military award ceremony, meant to honor local heroes who had served their country with bravery and dedication. Among the crowd was a young soldier in his late 20s, dressed in his formal uniform. He stood quietly at the back, his posture straight and his expression calm, but his eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. He had been invited to the ceremony, but not for the reason he had hoped. Months earlier, he had been part of a mission that had gone terribly wrong. Despite his heroic actions, which had saved the lives of several comrades, he had been denied a medal. The decision had been a blow to him, but he had accepted it with quiet dignity, choosing to focus on his duty rather than seek recognition. As the ceremony began, the young soldier took his seat among the crowd. He watched as other soldiers were called to the stage, one by one, to receive their medals. Each time a name was announced, the crowd erupted into applause, and the soldier clapped along, his smile never wavering. But deep down, he couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. He had risked everything that day, and yet, it seemed his efforts had been forgotten. The ceremony continued, with speeches from high-ranking officials and heartfelt stories of bravery and sacrifice. The young soldier listened intently, his respect for his fellow servicemen unwavering. But as the event drew to a close, he began to feel a sense of relief. Soon, it would be over, and he could return to his quiet life, far from the spotlight. Just as the final speaker was about to conclude the ceremony, something unexpected happened. An elderly man, dressed in a simple suit, stood up from the audience and walked toward the stage. The crowd fell silent, curious about what was happening. The man, who was clearly not part of the official program, approached the microphone with a determined look in his eyes. "Excuse me," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know this isn't part of the plan, but there's something I need to say." The officials on stage exchanged puzzled glances, but they didn't stop him. The man turned to face the crowd, his gaze scanning the audience until it landed on the young soldier. "That young man sitting there," he said, pointing toward the soldier, "saved my son's life. I don't know if any of you know his story, but I do. And I think it's time everyone else did, too." The young soldier's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the man now. It was the father of one of the comrades he had saved during that fateful mission. The room was silent, every eye fixed on the elderly man as he began to speak. The elderly man's voice trembled slightly as he began to speak, but his words were clear and filled with emotion. "My son was part of the same unit as this young soldier," he said, gesturing toward the young man in the crowd. "During a mission earlier this year, their team was ambushed. It was chaos, gunfire, explosions, and confusion everywhere. My son was injured, trapped, and unable to move. He thought it was the end." The crowd listened in stunned silence, captivated by the man's story. The young soldier sat frozen in his seat, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected this. He had tried to put that day behind him, but now it was all coming back. The man continued, his voice growing stronger. "This young soldier," he said, pointing again, "risked his own life to save my son and several others. He didn't hesitate. He ran into the line of fire, pulled my son to safety, and then went back for others. He was injured in the process, but he kept going. He didn't stop until everyone was out of harm's way." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. The young soldier felt his face grow warm as all eyes turned to him. He wanted to shrink into his seat, to disappear, but he couldn't move. He could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze, their curiosity and admiration pressing down on him. The elderly man's voice broke as he continued. "When I heard that he was denied a medal for his actions, I couldn't believe it. How could someone so brave, so selfless, be overlooked. I knew I had to do something. I reached out to others who were there that day, and we started gathering evidence, testimonies, reports, anything we could find to show the truth of what happened. The young soldier's eyes widened in surprise. He had no idea that anyone had been fighting for him, trying to get his actions recognized. He had accepted the decision and moved on, believing it was the end of the matter. But now, it seemed, there was more to the story. The man turned to the officials on stage. I know this isn't part of the ceremony, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. This young man deserves to be honored. He deserves to be recognized for what he did. Not just for saving my son, but for showing us all what true bravery looks like. The crowd murmured, some nodding in approval, others looking skeptical. The young soldier remained seated, his mind racing. He didn't know what to think or feel. Part of him was grateful for the man's efforts, but another part wished the whole thing would just go away. He had never been comfortable in the spotlight, and this sudden attention was overwhelming. As the ceremony came to an end, the young soldier was approached by several people who wanted to shake his hand and thank him for his service. He accepted their gratitude with a humble smile, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about what the elderly man had said and what it might mean for him. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his small apartment, the young soldier replayed the day's events in his mind. He thought about the mission, the lives he had saved, and the medal he had been denied. He had always believed that doing the right thing was its own reward, but now, he couldn't help but wonder if he deserved more. The next morning, he received a call from his commanding officer. "We need to talk," the officer said, his tone serious. "Come to the base as soon as you can." The young soldier's heart sank. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew it couldn't be good. When he arrived at the base, he was ushered into a meeting room where several high-ranking officials were waiting. They greeted him respectfully but with a sense of formality that made him nervous. "We've reviewed the evidence presented at the ceremony," one of them said. "And we've decided to reopen your case." The young soldier's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected this. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It means," the officer said, "that we're going to take another look at what happened that day. If the evidence supports it, you may receive the recognition you deserve." The young soldier felt a mix of emotions, relief, hope, but also fear. He had spent so long trying to move on from that day, and now it was all coming back. But deep down, he knew this was important. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been there that day. As he left the base, he felt a sense of determination. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same courage and humility that had guided him through everything else. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't alone anymore. The days that followed the ceremony were a whirlwind for the young soldier. News of the elderly man's speech had spread quickly, and suddenly, he found himself at the center of attention. Reporters called for interviews, local newspapers wanted to feature his story, and even strangers stopped him on the street to thank him for his bravery. It was overwhelming, to say the least. He had always been a private person, someone who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. But now, it seemed, the spotlight had found him. Despite the chaos, the young soldier tried to stay focused. He continued his duties at the base, working diligently in maintaining his usual routine. But it was hard to ignore the changes around him. His fellow soldiers treated him with a new level of respect, and even his commanding officers seemed to regard him differently. It was as if the world had suddenly realized what he had done, and he wasn't sure how to handle it. One afternoon, as he was finishing up his work, he received a message to report to the base's administrative office. When he arrived, he was greeted by a stern-looking officer who handed him a stack of documents. "These are the testimonies and reports we've gathered so far," the officer explained. "We're conducting a thorough review of your case, and we need your cooperation." The young soldier nodded, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. He took the documents and spent the next few days carefully reviewing them. As he read through the testimonies of his comrades, he was struck by their words. They spoke of his courage, his selflessness, and his unwavering determination to save lives, even at great personal risk. Reading their accounts brought back vivid memories of that day, the chaos, the fear, and the adrenaline that had driven him to act. One testimony, in particular, stood out to him. It was from the comrade he had saved, the son of the elderly man who had spoken at the ceremony. "I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for him," the comrade had written. "He didn't just save my life, he gave me a second chance. I'll never forget what he did." The young soldier felt a lump form in his throat as he read those words. He had never thought of his actions in those terms. To him, it had simply been the right thing to do. But now, seeing the impact he had made, he began to understand why so many people were fighting for him. As the review process continued, the young soldier was called in for several interviews. He answered questions honestly and openly, recounting the events of that day in as much detail as he could remember. It wasn't easy, reliving those moments brought back painful memories, but he knew it was necessary. He wanted the truth to come out, not for his own sake, but for the sake of everyone who had been there. One evening, as he was leaving the base, he was approached by a group of soldiers from his unit. They had been among those who had submitted testimonies in his favor. "We just wanted to say thank you," one of them said, his voice filled with sincerity. "What you did that day, it meant everything to us. We've got your back, no matter what." The young soldier felt a surge of gratitude. He had always seen himself as just one part of a team, but now, he realized how much his actions had meant to his comrades. Their support gave him strength, reminding him that he wasn't alone in this fight. A few weeks later, the young soldier received another call from his commanding officer. The days leading up to the medal ceremony were a blur of activity for the young soldier. The base was abuzz with preparations, and he found himself pulled in multiple directions, fitting for his uniform, rehearsing for the ceremony, and meeting with officials to discuss the details. Despite the chaos, he tried to stay grounded, reminding himself of why this was happening. It wasn't about the medal or the recognition, it was about honoring the sacrifices made that day and the lives that had been saved. The evening before the ceremony, the young soldier received a visit from the elderly man who had spoken up for him at the previous event. The man looked older and more tired than the last time they had met, but his eyes still sparkled with determination. "I just wanted to wish you luck," he said, his voice warm but tinged with emotion. "You deserve this, more than anyone I know." The young soldier felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. You gave me a voice when I didn't have one." The man shook his head. "No, son. You gave me my son back. That's a debt I can never repay." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Then the elderly man patted the soldier on the shoulder and left, leaving the young man alone with his thoughts. The next morning, the town square was once again filled with people, but this time, the atmosphere was different. There was a sense of celebration in the air, a feeling of pride and unity. The young soldier arrived early, dressed in his formal uniform, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. He took his place among the other honorees, trying to stay calm as the ceremony began. The event started with speeches from high-ranking officials, who spoke about the importance of bravery, sacrifice, and service. The young soldier listened intently, but his mind kept drifting back to that day. The day he had risked everything to save his comrades. He thought about the fear he had felt, the adrenaline that had driven him, and the relief he had experienced when it was all over. It was a day he would never forget. Finally, it was time for the medals to be awarded. One by one, the honorees were called to the stage, their names echoing through the square as the crowd erupted into applause. The young soldier watched with pride as his fellow soldiers received their recognition, knowing how much they deserved it. Then, it was his turn. For extraordinary courage and selflessness in the face of danger, the announcer began, his voice ringing out across the square, "We honor this soldier with the Medal of Valor." The crowd erupted into cheers as the young soldier stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked to the center of the stage, where a high-ranking officer stood waiting, holding the medal. As the officer pinned the medal to his uniform, the young soldier felt a surge of emotions, pride, gratitude, but also humility. He knew that this moment wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who had been there that day. It was about the lives that had been saved, the sacrifices that had been made, and the bonds that had been forged in the heat of battle. The officer stepped back and saluted him, and the young soldier returned the gesture, his hand trembling slightly. Then he turned to face the crowd, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. He saw his fellow soldiers, their expressions filled with pride and respect. He saw the elderly man, standing at the back with tears in his eyes. And he saw the families of those he had saved, their gratitude shining through. For a moment, he was at a loss for words. Then, taking a deep breath, he stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This medal isn't just for me. It's for everyone who was there that day, for the brave men and women who fought beside me, for the families who supported us, and for the lives we were able to save. I'm honored to accept this on behalf of all of us." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the square. The young soldier felt a sense of closure, a feeling that he had finally been given the recognition he deserved. But more than that, he felt a deep sense of gratitude, for the people who had fought for him, for the comrades who had stood by him, and for the opportunity to continue serving his country. As he stepped down from the stage, he was surrounded by well-wishers, fellow soldiers, family members, and even strangers who wanted to shake his hand and thank him for his service. He accepted their gratitude with a humble smile, but his mind was already looking ahead. He knew that this wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, the young soldier looked at the medal hanging on his wall. It was a symbol of everything he had been through, but it was also a reminder of the responsibility he now carried. He knew that he had been given a second chance, not just to serve his country, but to make a difference in the lives of others. And as he drifted off to sleep that night, he felt a sense of peace. He had faced his fears, honored his duty, and been recognized for his bravery. But more than anything, he had learned the true meaning of courage, not just in the heat of battle, but in the quiet moments that followed, when the real work of healing and rebuilding began. The days following the medal ceremony were a whirlwind for the young soldier. The recognition he had received brought with it a new level of attention, both from the military and the public. Reporters reached out for interviews, community groups invited him to speak at events, and even schools asked him to share his story with students. It was overwhelming, but the young soldier tried to embrace it with the same humility and grace that had guided him through everything else. One of the first invitations he accepted was to speak at a local high school. The students were eager to hear his story, and he hoped to inspire them with a message of courage, resilience, and the importance of helping others. As he stood in front of the auditorium, looking out at the sea of young faces, he felt a sense of responsibility. These were the future leaders, the ones who would carry the torch of kindness and bravery into the next generation. "I'm not here because I'm special," he began, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I'm here because I was given an opportunity to do the right thing, and I took it. That's all bravery really is, doing what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's scary." The students listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity. He shared the story of the mission, the chaos of that day, and the moments that had defined his actions. But he also spoke about the aftermath, the doubts, the struggles, and the lessons he had learned along the way. "It's not about the medals or the recognition," he said. "It's about the people you help, the lives you touch, and the difference you make." When he finished, the auditorium erupted into applause. Several students approached him afterward, their faces filled with admiration. "You're my hero," one of them said, her voice trembling with emotion. The young soldier smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. If his story could inspire even one person to be kinder, braver, or more compassionate, then it was all worth it. But not everyone was supportive. "We've been monitoring the public response to your recognition," one of them began. "And we want to assure you that we stand by our decision. Your actions were heroic, and you deserve this honor." The young soldier felt a wave of relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "That means a lot to me." The officer nodded. "But we also want to prepare you for what's to come. The higher your profile, the more scrutiny you'll face. It's not fair, but it's the reality. You'll need to stay strong and focused." The young soldier took the officer's words to heart. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to stay true to himself and his values. He continued to accept speaking engagements and interviews, but he also made time for the things that mattered most: his duties at the base, his fellow soldiers, and the community that had supported him. One day, as he was leaving the base, he was approached by a young boy, no more than 10 years old. The boy was holding a piece of paper, his eyes wide with excitement. "Are you the soldier who got the medal?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. The young soldier smiled. "Yes, I am." The boy handed him the paper, which turned out to be a drawing. It depicted the young soldier in his uniform, standing tall and brave, with the words, "My hero," written at the top. The young soldier felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at the drawing. "This is amazing," he said. "Did you draw this?" The boy nodded proudly. "I want to be like you when I grow up." The young soldier knelt down to the boy's level. "You don't have to wait until you grow up to be brave," he said. "You can start right now. Just by being kind, helping others, and standing up for what's right." The boy's eyes lit up, and he nodded eagerly. "I will," he promised. As the young soldier walked away, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The medal, the recognition, the criticism, it all paled in comparison to moments like this. He had been given a platform, and he was determined to use it to make a difference, one person at a time. But as he looked ahead, he knew that his journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, lessons to learn, and lives to touch. And as he prepared for the next chapter of his life, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The young soldier's life continued to evolve in ways he could never have imagined. The medal had opened doors for him, but it had also brought new challenges. He found himself balancing his military duties with public appearances, interviews, and community engagements. It was a lot to handle, but he remained committed to his mission, to inspire others and make a positive impact. One of the most meaningful opportunities came when he was invited to speak at a veteran support group. The group was made up of men and women who had served in various conflicts, many of whom were struggling with the physical and emotional scars of war. The young soldier felt a deep connection to them, knowing firsthand the sacrifices they had made. As he stood before the group, he shared his story with honesty and vulnerability. He spoke not just about the mission that had earned him the medal, but also about the struggles he had faced afterward, the doubts, the nightmares, and the difficulty of adjusting to life after combat. "It's okay to not be okay," he said, his voice filled with empathy. "What matters is that we're here for each other, that we keep moving forward, one step at a time." The veterans listened intently, their faces reflecting a mix of emotions, pain, hope, and understanding. When he finished, several of them approached him to share their own stories. One man, a veteran of a conflict decades earlier, clasped his hand and said, "Thank you. You've given me hope that it's possible to heal." The young soldier felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had always seen his medal as a symbol of his past actions, but now he realized it was also a tool for the future, a way to connect with others, to offer support, and to create a sense of community. But not all his experiences were positive. As his profile grew, so did the criticism. Some accused him of using his story for personal gain, while others questioned the validity of his actions. The young soldier tried to ignore the negativity, but it was hard not to feel the sting. One particularly harsh comment online read, "He's just a poster boy for the military. Nothing special." The words lingered in his mind, threatening to undermine his confidence. But then he remembered the veterans he had spoken to, the students who had called him their hero, and the young boy who had drawn his picture. Those were the moments that mattered, the ones that reminded him why he was doing this. One evening, as he was reflecting on the challenges he faced, he received a call from the elderly man who had spoken up for him at the ceremony. "I heard about the criticism," the man said, his voice filled with concern. "Don't let it get to you. You've done more good than you realize." The young soldier felt a surge of gratitude. "Thank you," he said. "That means a lot." The man chuckled softly. "You're like a son to me now. I'll always be in your corner." The conversation lifted the young soldier's spirits, reminding him that he wasn't alone. He had a community of people who believed in him, who supported him, and who were inspired by his story. That was what truly mattered. As the months passed, the young soldier continued to navigate the complexities of his new life. He accepted speaking engagements, mentored younger soldiers, and even started a small initiative to support veterans transitioning to civilian life. It was exhausting at times, but it was also deeply rewarding. One day, as he was preparing for a community event, he received a letter in the mail. It was from the young boy who had drawn his picture. The letter was filled with gratitude and excitement, detailing how the boy had started a kindness club at his school, inspired by the soldier's words. "You're my hero," the boy wrote. "And I'm going to be brave, just like you." The young soldier felt tears welling up in his eyes as he read the letter. It was moments like this that made everything worth it, the challenges, the criticism, the sleepless nights. He was making a difference, one person at a time. As he looked ahead, he knew that his journey was far from over. He knew that his true strength came from the bonds he had forged with his comrades, and he wasn't willing to sacrifice that for fame. One day, while on a routine training exercise, he received a message that stopped him in his tracks. It was from the elderly man who had spoken up for him at the ceremony. The message was brief but urgent: "I need to see you. It's important." The young soldier's heart raced as he made his way to the man's home. When he arrived, he found the elderly man sitting in his living room, looking frail but determined. "I'm not doing well," the man admitted, his voice weak but steady. "But before I go, there's something I need to give you." The young soldier felt a lump form in his throat. "You don't have to give me anything," he said gently. "You've already done so much for me." The man shook his head. "This isn't for you. It's for the future." He handed the young soldier a small, worn journal. "This belonged to my son," he explained. "He wrote about that day, the mission, what you did, and how it changed his life. I want you to have it. Use it to keep telling your story, to keep inspiring others." The young soldier accepted the journal with trembling hands, feeling the weight of its significance. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I'll honor this. I promise." The man smiled, his eyes filled with pride. "I know you will." A few weeks later, the elderly man passed away peacefully in his sleep. The young soldier attended the funeral, standing quietly among the mourners as they paid their respects. He felt a deep sense of loss but also gratitude. The man had been a father figure to him, a guiding light in his darkest moments. And now, he had entrusted him with a legacy, a story that needed to be told. The young soldier returned to his duties with a renewed sense of purpose. He began incorporating the journal into his speeches, sharing excerpts that highlighted the courage and resilience of his comrades. The response was overwhelming. People were moved by the raw honesty of the entries, and the young soldier found himself connecting with audiences on a deeper level. But as his influence grew, so did the challenges. He faced increasing scrutiny from the media, with some outlets questioning his motives or digging into his past. It was exhausting, but the young soldier refused to let it deter him. He focused on the positive impact he was making, the lives he was touching, and the legacy he was building. One evening, as he was preparing for a major speaking event, he received a call from his commanding officer. "We need to talk," the officer said, his tone serious. The young soldier's heart sank. Had the criticism reached the higher-ups again? Was his medal in jeopardy? When he arrived at the base the next morning, he was ushered into a meeting room where several high-ranking officials were waiting. They greeted him respectfully, but their expressions were unreadable. "We've been monitoring the public response to your work," one of them began. "And we want to offer you a new role, a position where you can continue to inspire others while also serving your country." The young soldier listened intently as they outlined the details. Nervousness, but also determination. He knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready. He had faced the darkest moments of his life and come out stronger on the other side. And now, he was determined to use his story to light the way for others. The young soldier's new role took him across the country, sharing his story with diverse audiences, students, veterans, community leaders, and fellow soldiers. Each event was an opportunity to inspire, to connect, and to remind people of the power of courage and kindness. Though the travel was exhausting, he found fulfillment in the faces of those who listened, their eyes lighting up with hope and determination. One of his most memorable stops was at a small town in the Midwest. The community had been hit hard by economic struggles, and many of the young people felt lost, unsure of their future. As the young soldier stood on the stage of the local high school gymnasium, he looked out at the sea of faces and felt a deep sense of responsibility. "I know what it's like to feel lost," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know what it's like to face challenges that seem impossible. But I also know that we're stronger than we think. We have the power to make a difference, not just in our own lives, but in the lives of others." He shared his story, not just the heroic moments, but the struggles too, the doubts, the fears, and the lessons he had learned along the way. When he finished, the room erupted into applause, but it was the quiet moments afterward that stayed with him. A young girl approached him, her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she said. "You made me believe in myself." Those moments were what kept him going, even when the road was tough. But as his influence grew, so did the challenges. The media scrutiny intensified, with some outlets painting him as a manufactured hero or questioning the authenticity of his story. The criticism was hard to ignore, but the young soldier tried to focus on the positive impact he was making. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, he received a call from his commanding officer. "I know it's not easy," the officer said, his voice filled with understanding. "But you're making a difference. Don't let the noise drown out the good you're doing." The words were a reminder of why he had started this journey. He wasn't doing this for fame or recognition, he was doing it to honor the legacy of the elderly man, the comrades he had served with, and the lives he had touched along the way. As the months turned into years, the young soldier's story continued to resonate with people across the country. He became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is light. But he never forgot where he came from. He remained humble, grounded, and committed to his values. One day, as he was preparing for a speaking event, he received a package in the mail. It was from the family of the elderly man who had spoken up for him all those years ago. Inside was a letter and a small, framed photograph. The letter read, thank you for keeping his legacy alive. He would be so proud of everything you've done. This photograph is from the day of the ceremony, the day he stood up for you. We thought you might like to have it." The young soldier felt tears welling up in his eyes as he looked at the photograph. It was a reminder of where it had all begun, of the kindness and courage that had set him on this path. He placed the photograph on his desk, where he could see it every day, a constant reminder of his purpose. As he looked ahead, the young soldier knew that his journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more lessons, and more opportunities to make a difference. But he was ready. He had faced the darkest moments of his life and come out stronger on the other side. And now, he was determined to use his story to light the way for others. And as he stood on the stage that evening, looking out at the faces of those who had come to hear him speak, he felt a deep sense of peace. He was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. And he knew that, no matter what the future held, he would face it with the same courage, humility, and kindness that had guided him through everything else.